Welcome, everyone. Hope you're all having a lovely day. Thank you for taking the time to join us for a webinar today. Um, just a couple of housekeeping notes. You should all have a show captions, closed captions button available for you if you'd like to be able to sort of translate what we're saying today. There's also a Q&A open for attendees to be able to ask us any questions. And finally, we also have a poll which has been launched already, which you should be pleased if you could take a few minutes to answer. That would be fantastic, and that will help us gather some more sort of poll questions essentially. Um, okay, so let's jump in. Today is the next webinar in the series of webinars for the Racer framework. So just to give you guys an indication, like we had a previous webinar about a few weeks ago, which our COO Will Lytle had hosted. So during that webinar, he really speaks about the Racer framework, talking about how you're able to go from rollout all the way through to the results, and all the steps in between as you are undertaking your AI transformation journey. It really helps to start to put things into perspective and hopefully will be a useful way for you to understand and have a framework to start building your AI transformation journey around. In that webinar, he did speak a little bit around the constraint side of things. And today, what we're going to do is we're going to focus very much on the constraints bit of the Racer framework, which is the C in the Racer framework. And we have two leaders from Citation, one of our customers, joining us for this as well. And they'll be here to answer some questions and will be more of a sort of back and forth webinar that we'll be doing today. Okay, so without further ado, introducing Dan and Phil. Dan, you'd like to go first to do a quick introduction?
Hi everyone. So I'm Daniel Talentire. I'm one of the engineering managers at Citation Group. So that means I look after a number of engineering teams across different business units and support them strategically and tactically and helping them get the best out of all the tools that are available to them and build the best quality software that they can.
Thank you very much, Dan. Phil, over to you.
Hey everyone, I'm Phil Doyle. I'm an agile coach. My passion, my interest is all really helping teams to get the best out of themselves and creating a high performing organization. My background, dare I say, was project management, program management. But over the years, my passion was really continuous improvement. So I transitioned over to agile coaching, really, so I could help teams be the best they could be.
Lovely, thank you. So for the attendees, you have two differing perspectives here from a technical perspective and also a ways of working perspective. So we would love to, I think it works well so that you can understand how, as you're going on your AI transformation journey, what are the different things to look out for and how you need to start thinking about these things as time progresses. Okay, so just moving on. Before we get started into the meat of the sort of the content today, I just wanted to ask Dan and Phil a few questions just to get a bit of a background for everyone before we get into the actual conversation around constraints. So Dan and Phil, any one of you, let's start by just talking about why you started using AI tools at Citation.
Yeah, why don't I start us off with that? I suppose AI tools is such an opportunity, but it also represents a challenge we need to rise to, a threat we need to be aware of, a problem we need to solve. It's very much like everyone, they're aware of AI as the topic of the day, but trying to make sense of it and how can we make use of this tool? What do we need to do? And there was probably kind of a mixed bag of emotions and thoughts and fears and concerns, but also excitement, really. We knew it had the capacity to really help us and support us. But how do we take this emerging technology and how do we really industrialize it at scale across our organization to be successful? And thinking about results, the second point there, one of the kind of challenges is we definitely saw some bright spots early on, but we probably ran into as many challenges as we did successes. And it was the idea that actually it's not just about implementing a tool, it was very much thinking more broadly about how do we build these tools into our entire life cycle? How do we rethink the entire way we approach work? And I think that was when we saw that it was very much more of almost a systems thinking challenge that I think we'll probably touch on a little bit more later on. I'm sure Dan, from the engineering perspective, trying to look at all the different tools, the day in the life of an engineer and how we use these tools is really a kind of a bit of an existential challenge, really.
Yeah, and I think early on it was very much these tools exist and people are reporting some interesting results. What does that mean for Citation Group? We didn't go into it thinking this is going to improve our workflow by X%. That's what we must do. We went into it thinking, well, how does this apply to the way that an engineer works on a piece of software, and in what ways can this make the engineer's role easier, better, more accessible? And for us, that was really where we were coming from, and the way that we went about through the process as we see what we did and what we did on the journey. That was something that we tried to bring through with every conversation I had with my engineers, to help them understand why we were taking them on this journey.
Was there, just out of interest, when you started off on this journey, like, was there a lot of maybe resistance from engineers, or were they excited about it? Like, what was the general feeling? Because I think a lot of our attendees might be facing similar sort of issues, with their engineers in particular.
I think it was quite mixed. I think a lot of engineers, it depended on the experience they'd had. The tools adapted so quickly that an engineer could go from testing something out one week and finding that it didn't help them, it didn't work, it took more time to a new model gets released a week later, and the capability of the tool changes overnight. And then having that open-minded approach to trying to reconsider that problem, which is something that we always do as engineers, but I think not in such rapid cycles of this is not useful to me or this is fantastically useful to me. So there was resistance in some ways of, oh, I tried that and it didn't work. And it was a bit of a trying to open people's eyes a little bit to the possibilities or the examples where it had worked in with other teams or other tools or other pieces of code where we'd found success, and trying to highlight that. But generally, people were very interested in it and very keen to see where the benefits could be found.
Yeah, that's good to hear, right? Like, it's if you have curious minds, and it's likely going to lead to much better results, and at least from an initial adoption perspective as well. Again, like, maybe coming down to the last question here, like, did you start to see, results straight away? I know Fid, you touched on that a little bit, and that's going to be the meat of the conversation today for everyone. But just, out of interest, like, what did you guys start to see initially when you first saw this?
It's quite interesting, isn't it? We definitely saw some things of interest, but once we were trying to really invest in it over time, it was like, how can we materially tie back the actual outcome to the work we were doing? And it's really trying to have that mindset of being outcome focused and really tie the investment of the time and the effort and the cognitive load to trying to create those outcomes. And it was a little bit tricky. I think that's why it's quite useful that you guys are obviously bringing out your racer framework. It gives us a good mental model to think about how it does adopting these tools, looking at our entire kind of life cycle and our workflow and system and tying it into those kind of outcomes. I think that's where a lot of the challenges has been, and a lot of thought went into it. So yeah, we can explore that more today.
Yeah, that's exactly what, we're looking to talk about today as well, is because a lot of our companies and a lot of our customers, and even ourselves for that matter, to be honest, because we are using a lot of AI tools as well, is that it's not just a case of, yes, merely throw a bunch of licenses at your engineers and things will magically improve. It's no silver bullet really. And that's kind of what we have seen a little bit of as well. Like, this is, if you look at the study that was done by MIT last year, it was experienced developers actually took a lot longer to sort of adopt and deliver using AI tools, despite believing that they were faster. So this is what the paradox has been, and a lot of companies are facing this. And I think, when having conversations with yourselves at Citation, that's when it kind of opened our eyes to the fact that, oh yes, like, it's not just a case of, if you have engineers suddenly becoming a lot faster, being able to do a lot more with the tools, does that actually mean that it's going to result in productivity improvements without thinking about from a, Phil, you mentioned from a systems level thinking, like, I think that's the key bit that we do want to kind of make sure that everyone understands today, is the fact that it's not just about throwing a bunch of licenses and expecting improvement straight away. It's about then thinking about other constraints around your process. And I think that's where it brings me on nicely onto the next slide. So again, individual and system levels constraints, so Phil and Dan, like, would be interesting to understand from your side, like, why you started thinking about applying the theory of constraints, into the use of AI tools. So one, if you want to take that, please.
Yeah, I can start off on that. So, if people aren't familiar with the theory of constraints, it's a theory that's been around for some while, and it crudely kind of visualizes almost like a pipe, a hose pipe, and you've got value or work flowing across this hose pipe, and there's going to be some kinks in that pipe. There are going to be constraints that interrupt the flow. And the kind of mental model of flow can be really useful for thinking about the flow value through your system. Those different constraints, there's going to be various types of constraints and different kind of places as part of that system. And you need to be really thinking about what work can we do to invest in removing these constraints is going to have the most effect upon the system. If we turn on the hosepipe mode and push more work into that progress, but there's some sort of massive constraint in the system that is interrupting the flow, any effort we do upstream or downstream of that primary constraint isn't really going to help us actually create more output or outcome. What we need to do is be focused, actually quite ruthlessly focused on what are the key constraints and putting our attention on those constraints. So I think the mental model of a constraint, identifying constraints and trying to see how we can mitigate them, as we'll see soon, actually being quite useful shared language across all different stakeholders and teams to understand the different type of challenges they're facing, articulate it as a constraint, and then give us the ability to compare and contrast them, understand which ones should we look to mitigate or which are less important at the moment.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point that you mentioned, right? Like if especially if you have, say, a massive bottleneck in the middle of your SDLC, like the fact that you're using AI tools isn't magically going to solve that, right? Like it's only going to amplify what is there. Like teams who are strong in terms of have very neat processes which are without many bottlenecks, etc., and are mature in that sense, they are the ones that we definitely know will start to become a lot more efficient and be able to deliver value a lot faster. But I think struggling teams would only find that AI just highlights the scale of the problems that they might have, and I think the point around bottlenecks shifting is a very, very apt one that we do have and that we have seen. It's not just from a I think what we see over here is the fact that, bottlenecks can actually move downstream. So, Dan, is this again from your role's perspective, like, is that something that you did start to see as well, in terms of, say, code review times or deployment processes, etc.?
Yeah, you start to see, and I think we're often aware of these things as engineers, but not necessarily in. That's one of the things that the constraints help to surface, because you're aware that you're going to get a bottleneck on review if you write certain types of code more quickly. So you're going to make review more difficult if you write more code. And the same applies whether you are writing code using an AI tool or not. But that if that AI is accelerating some parts of that code generation, then you are going to move that bottleneck. And you have to be really aware of what that does to the later parts of the system, whether that is the release process, whether that's the POs process, whether that's the testing, the QA process, whatever it is that you're building into the system. You can't view the software engineering or the code writing as an independent part. It's part of a whole of producing software and getting that software in the hands of the customer, because that's where the value comes from software, is the customers using the thing that you've made and being happy and buying more of your software.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's something which we've noticed with a lot of customers as well. I think not just from a downstream process, like I recently actually, what I've heard a lot about is on the product side as well. And the product definition side is where things are starting to become a possible bottleneck, in the sense where if you try and optimize your downstream processes from a code writing, review, and testing and deployment perspective, you do also have to realize that, whilst this becomes faster, sometimes, and I've heard from a couple of customers recently, is product teams can't keep up anymore. Like product teams are just ending up having to release either accelerate the way that they're working, and obviously they can start to use AI tools as well. And I think that's the key aspect that we do want to cover today with everyone, is to make sure that it comes across the fact that you need to think about it from a holistic systems perspective and not just from a engineering or a code writing perspective as well. Okay, so just wanted to leave you on with this to say that overall system speed is always going to be limited by the biggest bottleneck. I think that's one key thing to remember, and try and alleviate those bottlenecks before we get going. Okay, so in terms of today, we covered sort of three broad topics. Firstly, what was the resolution methodology? So we look at it from a racer framework perspective, but also then talk about what Citation did themselves, in terms of resolving certain constraints and how they address them essentially and what some of the results were. We'll also talk about some of the example constraints and where productivity improvements have been seen. Once these constraints are resolved is when you will really start to see the value of the use of AI tools, and that's what we're looking to cover today. And for the benefit of our audience, you have Dan and Phil here today to talk about some lessons learned as well, so that you don't have to, they've already gone through this journey for a little while now, and it might be always useful to sort of learn some lessons from them, which will hopefully help you accelerate your journey towards AI augmented engineering. Okay. Just FYI, by the way, for everyone, just if you have any questions, please use the Q&A box on your Zoom webinar, and we'll always be looking to answer straight as we go along. So please don't hesitate to ask any questions at any time. Okay, so jumping on to the resolution methodology. I will refer you back to our previous webinar again, where we'll talks about these in a lot more detail from a four-step constraint elimination process. Just to briefly touch on this today, so from an identify is obviously the key step to make sure that you know what these constraints are. Categorizing them into various different categories, so they could be technical, ways of working, infrastructure related, and so on and so forth. There's a lot of different ones on there. And how do you then address them, of course, is what we will sort of focus upon today with these 5 points. And finally, making sure that you do this continuously. It's not just a one and done kind of situation. It's about making sure that you're always iterating on this and really making sure that you are resolving all of the constraints that do come around, and resolve them as you go along, so that then you are able to improve this process a lot further. Okay, so let's talk about sort of the, how you guys went about sort of addressing some of these constraints. I know we had spoken about this previously in terms of how you baseline, train, embed, focus, and monitor. Would you guys like to sort of expand a little bit on this? Either one of you, Dan or Phil?
Sure. Why don't I start us off, and Dan, you could come in and add a bit of color. So it's really interesting. You mentioned the kind of identify and categorize kind of steps. We'll start on address, but I think it's really worth reiterating the identify aspect, because we all have a bias for action. We all probably have our subconscious bias as well, of recency bias or proximity bias. We're going to jump on the biggest, loudest challenge, and the amazing engineers we have the privilege of working with, they're going to do that same thing as well. They want to climb that mountain and solve that problem. But the important step is really those identify and categorize, to really cast the net widely and think, what are we going to address? Is this the most important thing we need to address right now? So going through that in the identify and the categorize step. So once we get to that address stage, we're really sure that this is the right thing we should put our attention on. And then baselining it is going to be really important, because if we don't baseline some sort of performance measures around it, how do we know we've actually made a difference? How do we know that what we're doing is working? We'll see a little bit later on, I think. We'll talk a bit about an experimental type approach that we're going to take to this, rather than a purely implementation type approach. And if we come to experiment and trying a few different approaches or solutions or techniques, we won't really know if they're having an effect unless we draw some sort of baseline. So pulling together a range of kind of tension metrics that are going to give us a high level perspective on the performance of the system right now is going to be a really good starting point. And then training people, it really always comes back to people. And it's interesting how much so far in the webinar we've talked in and around people. And it's always about putting people front and center, and the amazing people we have, and how we can really help them to be the best we can be. So training them to have the skills and the knowledge and the experience is going to be really critical, because otherwise we may just have isolated success in one area. But we really want to cascade and magnify that across our entire organization. So it's really training is our ability to amplify and kind of get the most out of that. Dan, do you want to add a little bit of color to some of the kind of training and some of the embedding stuff that we did?
Yeah, I think training. I think one other point on categorization is thinking about what happens if we don't solve this constraint, and I think that's something that quite a few of the constraints that we found, we asked that question and realized maybe this isn't actually a constraint that we need to resolve to help our overall solution, or whatever our overall goal is, and what way does it contribute towards our overall goal. And I think that's something that's really important to ask. But in terms of training, some of it is very similar to what we've done with training teams on how to work better together, working with AI is like working with another person to a degree, and the ways of which you interact with that system impact the results that you get. So a lot of the training that we took around addressing the constraints was around getting people more experience around using the different tools, exposing them to people who've eliminated those constraints, or just things like just giving people experimentation time to train themselves to get around those barriers. And I think that's really these things do take time. It's a new way of working, takes time to adapt to. It's not something where you can tell somebody the solution. They've got to feel it and touch it themselves and work with the tools themselves. You can't just give them a straightforward set of prompts and say, oh, this set of prompts is going to solve all your problems. That doesn't really work because they don't understand, they can't adapt to changes in the system, or they can't spot when something's going wrong. So that training part is
Only
so
it was that
core of
easy,
it.
right?
Oh, if it was then we wouldn't have any challenges if it was that easy.
Of course, yeah. I'll stop us a little bit over here, by the way, before we continue on. There's a couple of questions which has come up on the Q&A. Firstly, from Sergey. Hi, Sergey. Good to see you again. He's asking us if you could change one thing about how you rolled out agentic SDLC across your teams, what would it be?
It's an interesting question, isn't it? Because in a way, it's going through the pain and the difficulties and the challenges you have is what's going to help forward you and help you learn. So I think one answer to that question is it's okay to face those difficulties and those pain, because it's going to be a feedback loop, and don't expect that your own transformation should be pain free. In a way, setting yourself up to recognize the experimentation, the failures, and turning that failure into learning. Fail forward, fail fast, fail cheap. That's going to really help you succeed. But I think if I was to pick one thing off the top of my head that we'll probably touch on later on, I think we used hackathon style events as a real opportunity to give people to learn, to play around, to train, just cut out some time. And it kind of segues slightly across to one of the points we've got there about focus, really, and dedicating the focus time to removing those constraints. I was kind of thinking before the webinar that, our ability to focus both at an individual level and an organizational level, it's almost one of the kind of greatest challenges of our time, because there's just so many things trying to distract us and try to ask for our time and an investment of our thinking, that we need to make sure we have time to focus, to trial, to experiment. So it's definitely something we did a lot of, but we really see the value of it, and doing even more is going to be really helpful.
Yeah, I think that focus point is really key, right? Like, is that again just is that something that you found was a bit of an issue with the teams? Obviously from an hackathon perspective, you can then have actually people focusing on this, but overall, like once you go back into say BAU mode where you're developing and you're sort of going into that, like was focus a very big issue as such for the teams?
I think focus is always a challenge. It's not unusual when we're balancing kind of the investment of our time to say we're going to spend X% on this tech debt, we're going to spend Y% on bugs, or different, or Z% on innovation. Teams often do that, and that's a perfectly valid way of doing it. But if you're just trying to, I think, salami slice a small percentage of time to address AI constraints, to adopt AI tools, I don't think that's going to work. I think you need to have more of a big discussion about how do we carve out time and make this our absolute focus for a certain period of time. And I think, Dan, when we are doing some of the hackathon events and trying to promote some of the focus on our constraints, I think we were able to do that really and place these front and center.
Yeah, absolutely. I think part of it comes back down to that slow down a bit to speed up in the future as well, is that when we're focusing on the ways that we adopt the tools, it may take you more time to complete one or two of your tickets as you're going through and understanding the process. That is absolutely fine, and something that we should accept and expect. We need to help the engineers through that because they may feel like they're going slower. But the long-term goal of understanding when and how to use the different tools in different contexts is what we're aiming for with that.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you. Thank you, guys. Another question that has come up is, what if the code review process is also automated by AI tools? How does it affect on overall development performance from your guys' experience?
I think I'll take this one. So I think there's a lot of parts to this that are interesting to unpick. You can't let we can't mark our own homework in the same way when we do a code review, we don't review our own code. There's always a human for us responsible for the code that goes into production because we own what's happening with our production systems as engineers. We have to make sure that they are stable and they are safe for our users to use. Um, some parts of automated AI review are really helpful to the engineer because they're eliminating a lot of those nitpick pieces that maybe have come back from the AI review. That it gets you a very quick AI review straight away, so you can get some feedback that you can look at very easily as part of the process. You can add some sort of security oversight as well. That's you're asking for very specific things from the prompting tools. Um, overall, I think it improves the development, the engineer's experience. There can be some aspects of that that are everybody gets sometimes those sort of very nitpicky um, those very nitpicky code reviews, and sometimes the AI can do a lot of those very nitpicky code reviews that necessarily I want to keep this pull request small to have the lowest impact on our production system, and a lot of those nitpicks are not essential to what we're trying to do. But again, it's coming back down to engineering, the engineers having that oversight and making those decisions about what is important, what isn't.
Yeah, fantastic. I think, yeah, it's about making sure that you do use AI from that perspective where it can at least help you speed things up, maybe summarize some of the code review points, I'm guessing, and then you ultimately, the human should always try and do that so that you don't want to end up in a situation where you're going faster and by using AI tools and getting AI to automate a lot of your code reviews, etc. But then you end up in a situation where you have a lot of bugs that have been introduced into the system, which you will then have to pay down at some point in the future. So hopefully that doesn't materialize in that sense. Simon, thank you very much for the little point around the Lex Friedman talk with Peter Steinberger. I've answered on this, so hopefully everyone is able to see this. So if you do get some time, please please do view that video that you have on there. Andrada, we just come to you in a second, by the way, just to cover up and keep this moving along a little bit from a resolution methodology perspective. We kind of spoke about focus, train, and embedding your experts into your team so that it's not just a one and done kind of process. It's about making sure you're continuously improving this. We spoke a little bit on the focus side of things, and then obviously you want to monitor, right? Like you want to make sure you're monitoring and continuously improving. Like, is this actually taking effect? So just talking a little bit around the monitoring side of things, what you should be looking out for during your metrics or in your metrics, and Plandek is the greatest tool for you to be able to do so, is from a cycle time perspective, obviously you want that to reduce even as your PR volumes are increasing. So even if you're using AI for code reviews, etc., then you should be able to start to see that. Making sure your sprint predictability, so overall reliability and predictability of your engineers, of your teams, should be improving as well. So that's a really positive signal to see. Value delivery percentage, so how much time you're spending on delivering roadmap, as opposed to fixing bugs, etc. And like if you start to see that increase, then that's excellent. Be aware that you're not just creating a massive sort of run of tech debt with this and that just ignoring bugs essentially, because that can be a problem later down the line as well. Tech debt, of course, if you're stable, if you're using AI tools to try and improve upon your tech debt side of things, if it's stable or decreasing, then that's a really positive sign as well. Some things to look out for in terms of warnings it would be like individual productivity going up, but organizational throughput staying flat. So this speaks very, very clearly to the bottlenecks point, right? Like an individual might be more productive, they might be able to deliver a lot faster, etc., and get a lot of code written in a shorter amount of time, or but if your organization's throughput is not actually going up, then you know that there's bottlenecks in the other parts of your process, and that is exactly what a constraint is. And you have to make sure that you are resolving those to really start to see the improvements and start to see the productivity improvements that you will see from your tools. Firstly, again, like I mentioned before, is the product definition. So sometimes if that is becoming a problem, then your bottleneck is shifting more upstream rather than downstream. And that is also one thing to look out for whilst you're doing this. PR backlogs, making sure that if developers are writing code a lot faster now, then PR backlogs are possibly going to increase. So if you want to make sure that you do have good SLAs in place, or internal SLAs is what I like to call them, in terms of reviewing, approving, and merging these PRs so that work keeps flowing through the system. Testing time. So, again, this comes down to the point about adding or using AI tools holistically and not just from a development perspective. Making sure that you are doing that as well is very, very important. And deployment frequency. Like if you think about it, a very simple example is if your deployment frequency is still once a month, what is likely going to happen is if you're able to write code a lot faster, test it faster, and get stuff ready for release sooner, then each release is going to become riskier and riskier because you'll have more going into a particular release, and that's always going to be a problem. So if something goes wrong, a lot harder to pinpoint exactly what's happening. So you do want to keep an eye out on these things as well from a deployment frequency perspective. Okay, before we jump into the next slide, to answer Andrada's question, Dan and Phil, can you share some of the best practices for using AI in code? Pretty broad question as such, but if there's a couple of things that you might want to talk about, would be really good.
Yes, I can share some of those things. So I think there's like one of the general best practices is coming back to a bit of experimentation. I think how the using AI tools in your code base will vary depending on your code base, the type of programming language it is, the thing that it's creating. Is it a monolith? Is it microservices? There's lots of parts of that. Providing the tools with the appropriate context for the tools to be able to support what you need, the problem that you need to solve. And that's a big part of the challenge for using AI tools. It's learning how much context you need to provide and what types of context to get the result that you want, whether that's a refactor without breaking a bunch of other stuff, whether that's improving the way that your tests are written or the test coverage. You still need to give the right sort of context to the tool. So a lot of the time, we're doing this by creating shared sets of prompts that we use or workflows that we use that we can make repeatable, that we can test different tweaks to, that we can test with different models. But it's providing those clear prompts that provide the minimum amount of information that gets the agent doing what you want it to do.
Fantastic. Yeah, that's a really good point there, Dan. I think that's, making sure that you are using the right AI tools, I'm guessing, for the right jobs is a very important thing, and one that everyone should be looking out for as well.
And per engineer as well, that does affect. Like that some engineers prefer a CLI, some engineers prefer a web browser interface, some engineers like an IDE, and you're not necessarily going to make an engineer who doesn't like using IDEs and wants to use Vim and a CLI like using an IDE just by providing an AI tool on top of it. So there is those aspects to consider as well.
Yeah, a very important point there. Very important point. Okay, just in the interest of time to keep us moving along, the next thing that I wanted to kind of speak about over here was some example constraints, right? Like some things that you might see as you're going through your AI transformation journey. Let's talk a little bit around the technical and the ways of working constraints. So we're kind of divided them up into two. Do you want to go first, Dan, to maybe talk? You don't have to go through all of them, of course. Just a couple potentially that you might have seen before.
Yeah, these are just some examples of the sorts of constraints that we might have. So some AI tools may find it more difficult to work with certain programming languages or certain frameworks, perhaps because they can't run the tooling on the infrastructure that's provided. .NET framework being an example that it is sort of quite commonly there in some legacy code. If the AI can't execute and run the tests properly, then that can be a big challenge. If you've got a mixture of versions running across multiple related repos, these are all things that would cause problems for the engineers as well. But those sorts of things can cause significant problems for the AI tools because they lose the context. It doesn't remember that in file A it needs to use one version and file B it needs to use a different version of Node, because it doesn't remember that sort of thing unless you explicitly prompt it to do those things. But keeping those things separated can be quite challenging. And then sometimes, like maybe the way that you manage your secrets prevents the AI tools from using your test suite properly, or using the CI pipelines properly, and thinking about those sorts of things and eliminating that constraint, being able to run things independently, means that you can unlock different tools in a better way.
Yeah, so it's about, like what I'm getting from you, Dan, is more of think about these things, right? Like if you have these kind of things and just throwing AI tools at it is really not going to help. You need to make sure that you're resolving these to really harness the power of the tooling that you're investing in, which of course everyone that's where we do want to get to, of course. Moving on to some of the ways of working side of things. So Phil, obviously this is a key
Yeah,
part of your role, right? From an agile coach perspective. Like can you
absolutely.
talk us through like some of the issues that you did see potentially when you started doing this and maybe a little bit around how you did try and resolve these?
Yeah, sure. Well, it all really comes back to changing how we think and how we work. It's a people thing, isn't it, really? And the ultimate way we're going to address these is trying to cultivate a growth mindset for our organization. Some of the points there, like the first point, it wouldn't be unusual to try something out. And the first time, you know what, it just didn't work. And even the second time, it was a little bit painful. We need to have that growth mindset and cultivate that sort of awareness and the desire for change so that we're going to have that resilience. We're going to have that willingness to learn and try something differently and almost pick ourselves up and dust ourselves down and see it's almost a challenge to rise to rather than a threat to kind of maybe back away from, and trying to cultivate that in our teams and our organizations so that everyone's really on board with the journey and really seeing this as something that's really quite challenging but exciting. There is going to be that learning curve, and it's like I think we mentioned earlier. It's going to be more of a learning journey rather than a kind of implementation. It's not just purchase some licenses for some tools and then off we go. It's really going to be an ongoing trial of trying things out, experimenting, learning, adapting, making mistakes, and just being willing to make those mistakes, learn those lessons, and then really how quick and how effectively can we learn. Learning isn't just writing something down in one team, but it's really how we distill that knowledge and share it across our entire organization, and then instill it into our culture, into our day-to-day life, so that it just becomes sort of muscle memory. And it's not just engineers and techies who are used to these changes, but it's really trying to get our stakeholders and business people to come on this journey with us so they can think and work differently as well. And they're good people doing a good job, but we need to help them think differently. We need to help them ask sensible questions or to understand the kind of context of what we're doing so that we're working in partnership and really they can understand the journey we're going on, but also we can also help them see how they can get value from AI in their aspect of their role.
Yeah, and it's also about obviously setting that expectation that you're not going to
Yeah,
see 20% productivity improvement straight away, right? Like that's always important to try and do that. I think one thing that you mentioned around the learning curve aspect of it, and then how we do come onto this a little bit. So I'm giving you a little bit of a sneak preview on the key lessons learned side of things, is playbooks, right? Like having those documented playbooks, which will ultimately help you go along this journey a lot more, and as you sort of go into that side of things. So very important to try and do that. Okay, got a couple of questions come in. So firstly, do you or how do you measure code quality at Citation?
So we use Sonar Cube for our code quality assessment. So that's happening on every PR. Our AI agents are responding to Sonar issues. Ideally, they don't write code that has issues in, but so that isn't always the case. Very often that bit gets missed, but they are then automatically fixing those problems. That's one part of code quality. In terms of the code appears to be high quality and fits in with the formatting that we expect. That's sort of the minimum base level. I think the other piece is we measure it through how many PRs are accepted and commented on as well. So we look at how many PRs get reviewed successfully, whether they're from an AI tool or a human. And if we start to see a lot of comments, then we understand that there's a code quality issue there as well that we can investigate with either the tool, the way the tooling's set up, or the engineer and the way the engineer is working.
Yeah, no, pretty important point to try and make sure that you do, if you're using the agent tools, of course, then it should be looking out for those and not generating a lot more issues for you than actually helping you out. Another question from Andrada. Maybe this one's more for you, Phil. I noticed that the more experienced engineers are very hesitant on using AI. Do you have any advice on how to make them at least try experimenting with it?
That's a really great question because I think a lot of it comes back to identity. As our personal identity, we have cultivated and developed our expertise for years. And now, is it maybe under threat if we're going to have an AI tool that's going to be perceived to do this on behalf of us? And so, does that devalue me in some way? But I think what we really need to do is help them understand that AI is an amplifier. If you're an amazingly talented engineer, AI is going to help you be even more effective, and it's really going to, if anything, showcase your skills and your talents. So really helping them understand really a desire for that future state, that really it's an amplifier that's going to help them achieve even more. It's not a threat. So yeah, it's very much that conversation and setting the context for change. And if we don't do that early on, like the question kind of alluded to, that's going to become a constraint. Human factors can be constraints too. People's willingness to experiment, to try out tools, to keep on with it, even though we've hit some roadblocks.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, right? Like it's all about amplifying it. Like if you're talented and you are already pretty good at sort of writing code, of course, etc., from an engineering perspective, but then using AI tools should only make you faster. It should only make you a lot better and really amplify how good you are. So really key. Hopefully, that's a really good way of getting the senior engineers more on board with the use of these tools. Yeah. Okay, a final few slides, guys. I know we're almost out of time, but just to run through a little bit on the productivity improvement scene. So Phil, do you want to just cover a little bit around the throughput and the speed side?
Sure. Well, obviously, we mentioned at the start, we're focused on output, wrong outcomes, not just output, but we still want to see more outputs as a stepping stone to outcome. So throughput can be a really good clue. These are just signals, they're indicators, but in general, we would expect to see more PRs coming through. We need to be careful that it's of the same quality, like we've mentioned, and etc., that we can effectively deploy that through our entire system. But it can be a useful indicator that we should definitely be seeing that PR throughput rise, and we've seen that quite successfully in some of our teams. Speed as well. We called out that signal from earlier, Pranav, that you potentially slow down. We need to make sure that we're getting faster, or at least definitely not slowing down. So that's really comes back to that systems thinking and thinking about all the stages in terms of flow into our development, our code review process, and our ability to test and deploy code and actually release it to customers to get value. So we've definitely seen those, and they should be something that everyone should be paying really close attention to, because if we're not seeing that speed factor and that throughput factor, it's going to be a bit of an indicator.
Of course, yeah. I think one thing, if there was one thing that I would like everyone to kind of take away from this webinar today, is the fact that you need to think about this holistically, right? It's not just about from an engineering perspective. It has to be across your SDLC to really start to see those productivity improvements. Speaking of across the SDLC, a nice segue into the pipeline side of things now.
Yeah, so one of the things that as we get more pull requests coming in, as we get more change coming in, sometimes integrating those changes together can be more difficult and more challenging. And one of the things that we had in one of our teams was with the release process, if we had a database migration that needed to happen that would affect other branches that were in flow, other features that were in process, then that combining those things together became quite a manually intensive task, where effectively you would have to make sure that the thing that you were building didn't break other people's stuff. Other people would have to check that also that what you were doing wasn't going to break their piece. Whereas with Devin, we were able to essentially get Devin to do that for us. So it could take all of those branches that were currently open, evaluate them against the set of change or against the database migration, for instance, check to see if any of them had problems. It can run the pipelines, run the full test suite against it, and then make the fixes if something needs to be applied. And just that piece goes away from something that's quite an intensive, I've got to pull this branch, I've got to pull this branch from these different projects or microservices to see what's going to happen with them, to I can set this off, monitor, I can kick off a task, and it'll pop up to me in 20 minutes to say there's a problem here and there's a problem here, rather than me having to go through it individually and do that. So that was a really big improvement for one of our teams. And just thinking about that holistically, thinking about that as a an automation tooling that is able to identify when something is problematic, rather than only thinking about, well, what can we generate? What can we generate with the code? We're thinking about, well, what is using the understanding part of that LLM to figure out what the problem might be or whether there is a problem. And then feeding that in one of the other pieces constraints that we resolved. Originally, we had this constraint around, the AI tooling keeps the sonar issues get caught in the pipeline. One of the steps we then took was to use the MCP servers to eliminate that constraint. So rather than having to wait for the pipeline to complete to say, here's the sonar issues, giving the agent or even the local tool access to sonar through MCP allowed us to check those issues, but also get higher quality information about what that issue is, rather than just a message from the pipeline to say there's an issue with this line number. The tool could then get a sample piece of code which contains the correct fix for that problem. What's the pattern that solves this, and pull that down into the code base, and then potentially make multiple changes all at once to match up against that correct pattern.
Yeah, I think, speaking on code quality, they've got a really good another question come from Sergey, Dan. So Sergey's asking us, if you are pulling data from GitHub and working with it in SonarQube, because he's thinking around metrics like accepted PRs, review counts that you might have if you are using AI tools, especially in the agentic mode, like how many reviews are you facing, etc. Like, are these things that you guys were discussing as well in terms of, was that a possible constraint, for example, and how did you resolve that if you did face this?
So we're looking at some of those things in Plandek, looking at those sorts of metrics of AI versus non-AI. Is there a difference between number of views, number of comments, time to accept PRs? Are the engineers spending an appropriate of time reviewing a PR based on the size? Some things that can happen in some teams and organizations is that they see the green tick from the AI tool and think, oh, an AI's reviewed this, so there can't be any problems. And really, that's definitely not the behavior that we want. So we just make sure there's that continuous training on, this isn't a replacement for a human review, but it's a tool that you can use to assist you in making sure that the code moves through thoroughly. But I think getting that full picture of each of those parts and what the impact is on your process and pipeline, and looking in at the detail, and that's something that the tech leads in our teams do, look at the detail around, are we happy with how these PRs are being reviewed, whether that's using the agentic flows or not.
Yeah, I think really important to get the team leads and the tech leads involved in this, right? And making sure that they have the right playbooks in place as they're going through. Okay, I see we're already out of time, but I do want to spend a little bit of time on the key lessons learned side of things. So there's two slides of this, guys. Firstly, more on the technical side of things. So Dan, if you'd like to just talk through us a little bit around some of the lessons that you've learned that might help our attendees.
Yeah. So I think around understanding what tools people have used and understanding how people are using the tooling, one of the things that we found initially when we were trying to see the data, we were trying to understand how people are using. So in the early days, we had people using Claude Code, we had people using Windsurf, Cursor, Devin, and the broadness, we couldn't see what tools were being most effective, most cost effective for the PR throughput, most effective for the engineers. So we had to really do a little bit of work to understand and attribute changes to those different tools based on the users that are using them. So we implemented automatic PR tagging, and we wrote that automatic PR tagging tool using AI to make sure that that's an area where building internal tools is a fantastic use of your AI tooling, and that really helped us see the impact of the different changes and where engineers were having the most success.
Oh, fantastic. I think that's something which we have seen some of our other customers start using as well now, in terms of tagging those PRs and actually doing so automatically as well, so that you can start to see which ones are actually making a difference, right? Like, it's ultimately, maybe it's also a way of understanding which tools your engineers like to use the most, and start maybe investing a little bit more in that, etc. as well. I think one thing which, when we were speaking about this in preparation for the webinar, which I really liked, was the fact that you need to think holistically across your system. Like constraints will shift as you resolve them. It's not we mentioned this a little bit previously as well. It's not a one and done kind of view. It's about continuously resolving them as they come up. Like you might, once you resolve one thing, something else might come up. Do keep going. Like don't just give up, because if you do want to get to that more productive state of flow essentially, then that's definitely something that you should be doing as well. Um, from yeah, like Phil mentioned as well, like using hackathons, right? From an experimentation, making sure people are using that. In fact, we did this ourselves at Plandek. This was around February time or March time last year, where we had a hackathon where we had everyone from the business getting involved and using AI tools to start delivering prototypes, and it was really eye-opening in many ways for our engineers in particular, because they could see that, okay, how much could we do in such a short amount of time? It was a 24-hour hackathon, and then some of the prototypes that were generated were absolutely amazing. And then just trying to use those kind of things is a really good way of learning that and opening the eyes of the people within the company. Okay, last slide, sort of moving on from a ways of working perspective, Phil. Is there some things that you'd like to highlight for the group?
Yeah, we've got there start small because it's really easy to get all excited and throw everything in the kitchen sink at something. But really, what we can just do there is create excess noise and excess complexity. So I think it's quite an established concept in lean engineering that you start with like a model line, almost like a test and experiment, somewhere you can really learn from it before you scale it up and just think about how we're going to scale it up. The transformation is really an organizational transformation. It's people's, it's roles, it's expectation, it's language, it's meetings. It's trying to understand fundamentally, it's not just about implementing a tool, it's thinking and working differently. And so that means bringing the entire organization along. And bringing them along doesn't mean tell them this is what we're going to do. It's helping them understand how they need to change. It's role modeling them, it's supporting them, it's transformational leadership, because otherwise they could potentially become a constraint for you. What happens if you can't procure a tool quick enough, or get security approval for a tool, or get the architecture in place? Bringing it back to that constraint thinking, really, we need to see the entire organization as an engine for value delivery. Uh, we lend into playbooks quite a lot because playbooks give you a right balance between giving you enough prescriptive direction that teams can leverage that knowledge and that learning we referenced earlier, but they're not overly prescriptive or fragile where they're not going to work for an individual team's context on a certain piece of software. It kind of strikes that balance as a good way of us being able to spread those lessons around and really just cultivating that mindset of for continuous learning and adaptation and just making space for that, making sure that people are aware that's it's okay to fail as long as we fail forward and we learn from it and we share those knowledge. Really, that's how we're gonna succeed.
Yeah, I think one thing which, again, during our discussions prior to the webinar, which I found really insightful was, I think it was yourself, Phil, who had mentioned that you need to treat AI transformation like you would an agile transformation, like you would when we all did that a few years ago. Sort of treat it in a similar sort of way, because it is a revolution as such, right? Where you are starting to use these tools. So making sure that you are treating it with that same in that same vein and that with that same respect, if that's a way of putting it, to make sure that it is actually adopted across the organization is very, very important, because otherwise you will sort of get into that the flow of not fully committing to it, if you see what I
Yeah.
mean, and then that's ultimately what is going to get you the most results for your organization and in your investment for AI tools. And of course, like Plandek as a tool is really, really helpful to start measuring. And we spoke about baselining and monitoring. Like that's where we can really help you and ensure that you are starting to see the progress that is being made as well. Okay. Um, so I think that comes to the end of this for us today. Firstly, thank you so much, Dan and Phil, for taking the time today and joining us. I know this was really insightful, definitely for me, and I really hope that our attendees found that really insightful as well, and that you do have a lot of good things to take away from this. Massive thank you to all the attendees as well. Thank you so much for making the time today. I know this is we did go a little bit over time, but this was a lovely discussion, really good questions that have been asked as well. Hope you guys have a lovely rest of your day. And please do answer the poll questions if before you leave today. That would be really helpful. Thank you so much, guys. I hope you have a good rest of your day. And we'll speak to you very soon. Cheers. Thank you.